Hi, my name is Dr. Benedict Gaster. I work at the University of West of England, and today I'm going to introduce the first part of a short video series on version control, sometimes called source control. And during this series, I'll introduce you to the concepts of version control and why they might be useful, in particular in software development. And later on, we'll introduce a very popular source control, version control system called Git, that was developed by the computer scientist Linus Torvalds. When we think about software development, you can probably write down some tasks that you do every day when you're in a software development project, right? You might create some things, in particular, maybe creating new source code or adding new capabilities. And obviously we're going to save these things because we want to store them for reuse. For example, the most common ones are source files. There might be a Java source file or a C++ source file, for example. We're going to edit these files. For example, we might add new features, or we might need to fix a bug. And so we're going to edit these existing files. We might start off with an empty file and then edit it by adding some stuff to it. And of course, over time, we're going to save the same thing again and again. And these source files will keep updating and adding to. So this is one of the key goals, is that we're going to save these things again and again. And this really is the overall goal of our project. And so version control can help with this by providing a history of changes. It's really important, for us to be able to track what's changed over time, so we can review those changes and check they meet the requirements, for example. Or maybe we need to unwind it and go back and find a change and fix something. So to help with that, one of the things that we'll do in our history is that we'll record when the change was made, what date, what time it was made, why we made that change. Comments are really important in source code, and in the version history, we'll also want to keep a comment or a change log of why and what was made to those changes. Okay, and of course this means that we can review these changes at any time. We could undo them if we wanted to, and this allows us to do this at any time in the future. It could be years down the line when we chose to do that. Most likely maybe a couple of months or a few weeks. Okay, so to do this, we have this kind of notion of a history, a timeline where we're tracking changes to one or more source files in our project. Initially on the left-hand side here, you'll see that we have create initial source files, and this is the beginning, time zero is where we create the project, and we add some source files which potentially could be empty at the beginning of the project. As time moves on, we're going to implement the basic functionality. I've got some functionality to add two numbers together, or to calculate some cost analysis from a database, say. And then a little while longer, we're going to, of course, we're going to want to add some tests to verify the correctness of the functionality that we've implemented. You might implement that at exactly the same time, but potentially you might implement that a little later to verify that. And so you can see that we're slowly progressing along our timeline, adding new features. And every time we can record information about these additions and changes that we do. So once we've added the base tests, maybe everything's working to the basic functionality, we might then realize that there's some bugs. Maybe we discovered those with our tests, or maybe we've given it to one of our colleagues to test for us, to try something out, and they pointed out that there's a problem. Or maybe she notices that the feature, that X, was not quite as specified in the requirements, for example. Okay, as though we fix those things and as time moves on, we're probably going to implement some extended features. Our requirements might have had some stretch goals, which we're now stretching to implement, or just that we're in the second phase of our first part of our implementation, we're adding some new features. And of course, this can go round and round, right? You might add some new source files to implement a new feature. You might add some new tests to test a new feature, or maybe a bug was fixed, and so you added a new test to do that. And so this is not just a linear timeline. You can imagine going around in circles here, where we're adding new features, and each of these things come along. And then maybe later on, as your product development moves on, you decide that you want it to be running on more than just Windows. Maybe you want to run it on Linux or OS X, for example. And so there we might add functionality to ease porting between different systems. And then finally, as we move towards product release, we'll start to think about adding specific what's called labels. So you say this, not only have you got different points in your history, but you're actually adding a label to say, okay, this is the timestamp that tells us that we're making our alpha release, for example. So this is leading up, we have alpha, beta, and then final product release, for example. And all of this can be recorded along our timeline, our history tracking system in our version control. So you might say to yourself, wow, if it's just me working on this project, this is not too hard, is it? I could do this myself. Do I really need another system or another piece of software to help me manage this? And there's some truth in that, but if you imagine, even if you're just writing your own project, most projects of reasonable size could have, hundreds, if not thousands of source files, which could themselves be, hundreds of thousands of lines of code. And so even if it's just a single individual working a project, it could be quite tricky. For a single file, okay, then maybe this is not too hard, you might say. But, let's be honest, real projects are large and complicated. They don't just consist of a single file. They're not even one or two files. They're often hundreds of files with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lines of source code. And if you imagine a project might start off quite small, by the time you've worked on that for a number of years, a number of iterations, that the size of this project is much larger and complicated, more complicated than when you initially started it. Again, if you work for a company or you're deploying real software, developing an app for the iPhone, these sorts of things, you're likely to have many developers, many testers, and other different people working on a given project. Not that many projects have only one person working on them. Maybe it starts off with just one person in an incubation period, but over time, as it moves towards becoming a real product, then these things develop and you'll have many people working on it. On top of that, of course, there are the source files for your system, but there's design documents, there's tests, there's other assets. Imagine you're building a game, then you've got all of the images, all of the audio that will go with it, all of the databases that are used to make up worlds or levels, as they're often called in the games. And these are all used to build the final project. And these all need to have a history associated with them and tracked so we can understand what changes are being made, when they're being made, and why they're being made. And so this is really what we're talking about when we're interested in version control, is we're interested in managing, real projects, ones that are large and potentially worked on by many people. Okay, so that's the introduction of why version control might be useful. And next time, in the next video, we're going to look at version control systems and what capabilities and features they offer that allow us to manage our projects. Thank you.